The rules are still evolving on third-party advertising. You know, people who are of my and Troy's generation will remember a time when there was no restrictions at all, and people could just actually have freedom of speech in this country when they wanted to. You know, and gradually governments of all stripes have brought in these restrictions on non-political parties speaking during elections, and more recently they also want to do that outside of election periods, and in some provinces it's for a couple months before the election, and some it's longer. Alberta, under the previous government, wanted to make it permanent. The present government changed that to have a pre-period that's not all the time, but it's a moving target for sure.
Okay, great. Well, Bruce, I think you can go ahead and get into your presentation.
Sure. Sure. So I'm going to, most of you were very kind in your comments to me at lunch, but I felt like I was the most boring speaker this morning because it's a dry legal topic. I'm going to try and stand this time to make myself a little more animated. So I'm talking about legal restrictions on third-party advocacy, and really it's not just about third-party advertising legislation. Some third parties are going to be charities, so I'm going to talk a little bit about restrictions on charities as well. As I was saying in my opening comments, you know, some of us can remember elections where political parties could raise whatever they wanted from whoever they wanted and spend whatever they wanted. And in those days, third-party advocacy didn't really matter. If you were somebody who wanted a candidate to win or an issue to be advanced, you just donate money to the political party if you're a company, a person, whatever. And then we started restricting how much money candidates and parties could spend during elections and how much they could raise in an effort to get big corporations, I guess, out of politics or big money out of politics. And then what happened was third parties started to fill some of the gap. And in the 1988 federal election, the free trade election, all the left-wingers in Canada were fine with this system when most of the third parties were all a bunch of left-wing advocacy groups. But as soon as the free trade election happened in '88, and the corporate community in Canada massively put out campaigns to say free trade's a great idea and support it, and Brian Mulroney came from behind and won that election, all of a sudden you heard nothing but talk from all the people who know better than us that this was the worst thing ever, and free trade had gotten bought by corporations, and governments of various stripes started putting in restrictions on third parties, and the logic is this: political elections should be about parties, and parties are limited as to how much they can spend. So why should we have this big loophole where third parties can go and spend money? To me, there's a false logic to that, but it's something that took place in Canada, and it's the law, and we have to deal with it. So let's move in there. Oh, this is about Crease Harman. I don't need to tell you about me, but I'll tell you that I'm not giving anybody legal advice today. I'm just talking, and if you want legal advice, you have to pay me for it. So a bit of background about me. I've worked on lots of different third-party campaigns. I'm starting with a couple of what I call case studies. So 2008, Saanich Gulf Islands. Gary Lunn was a long-time Conservative MP in Saanich Gulf Islands, where I live. He generally won with a little more than a third of the vote on a vote split. The NDP and the Liberals always evenly got in the low 20s for him. And in 2008, the Liberals ran a left-leaning prominent environmentalist, and they also played what I think was a bit of a dirty trick and got a good friend of mine who was the NDP candidate disqualified after the ballots were printed by revealing something that he'd done as a teenager. In any event, he was out, and all of a sudden there was only one major candidate against Gary Lunn, and that person was somebody who was very attractive to a lot of NDP voters, and all of a sudden the public opinion polls were showing that the Conservatives were going to lose a seat that they'd had for a long time. Overnight, 12 different community groups registered as third-party advertisers. It was really the first election in Canada where this happened on a mass scale. There was the Saanich Taxpayers Association, the Peninsula Parks Society, a whole bunch of groups. None of them were actually incorporated entities. Most of them were funded by one person who happened to fund just enough to spend the limit for third-party advertisers. But for the last week of that election, there was lawn signs up about the carbon tax and the Stéphane Dion's tax on everything. And there was ads in all the local papers, and I know Hamish will say print ads don't matter, but they were all over the place for those on those Gulf Islands. And all those third parties had to be registered, and I registered them all. And Gary Lunn won a squeaker that election and went on to become a cabinet minister in the next government. So the left complains. Elections Canada launched an investigation into all these groups. There was really nothing they could do. There was no requirement that these groups be incorporated entities. They had all registered properly. They didn't spend more than their limit. But there was an allegation that they had colluded together in order to get around the spending limit on third parties. And they threatened to charge Lunn with colluding. I was not part of Lunn's campaign officially in that thing. He was a friend of mine and we talked, but I wasn't on his campaign team. So I was separate. They said, well, you all use the same lawyer. Well, there's no conflict there, and I didn't direct any of those things. They couldn't prove anything, but I was under an investigation for 6 years, so was Gary Lunn. Finally, it was dropped. By that time, he was long gone. Elizabeth May had come, and the world had changed, but it was an effective use of third-party advertising because he had spent his limit, and he managed to squeak it out. That's one example of why people register as third parties, is to make a difference in campaign. Here's another example. I was involved in a little more defensive, and I do a lot of this kind of work as well. Anybody who wants to advertise on an issue that supports or opposes a candidate or a party in an election must register as a third-party advertiser. And this is a very broad definition, and it captures a lot of people who are just doing what they think they should be doing. Wood fiber LNG was an LNG project in Squamish, proposing at that time to build a facility. It's under construction now. They got approval later, but at this particular point in time, they were going through environmental review process, and as part of that process, they were required to do advertising about their project in local newspapers and media. At the same time, they came to me and I told them, well, if you do that, what you're supposed to be doing, you're now advertising on an issue, which is a campaign issue. The NDP candidate in that riding wanted to shut this down and was opposed to having an LNG plant in the riding. This is a provincial campaign. The BC Liberal candidate in that riding was promoting the LNG plant. So by merely mentioning the fact that, hey, we want to build an LNG plant, they were now advertising on an issue which was a political issue deemed by Elections BC. I got an opinion from the Chief Electoral Officer, absolutely. The advertising, I've shown you an example there, it's pretty innocuous, lunch and learn, that's political advertising. So they had to register, they had to watch out what they spent, but we had to find a way to do that and still do the public consultation that they were required to do to keep their environmental assessment on track, or else they'd be shut down, and it was crazy. So their engagement included sending out newsletters, holding public meetings, and other activities, and we had to register them and find a way to do that. So other companies, maybe not in the middle of that kind of environmental review process, could just cease advertising if they find themselves caught up as a political issue. But lots of companies can be in this situation. If you're in a municipal campaign and you're a developer, and your development is all of a sudden an issue between candidates, you've got to be careful about how you promote your development. If you're a store that sells some controversial item, I don't know, marijuana, guns, whatever, could become an election issue. You could be in trouble. All kinds of people who might not think they're being political can get caught up in this, so it's just something to be concerned about. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are different ways in which these kind of third-party activities are governed. The Income Tax Act really deals with charities. So if you're a charity, you have to think about that. The Elections Act or various provincial equivalents deal with the third-party advertising, when you can't do it, how to register and what your limit is in different periods. There's also the Lobbying Act, which restricts certain kinds of direct advocacy, which is something that organizations need to think about when they want to get involved in promoting political ideas. And again, this isn't necessarily, in the Gary Lunn example, none of these groups directly said vote for Gary, but they were all focusing on issues that were obviously associated as anti-liberal issues or pro-conservative issues.
Bruce, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
So most of the clients that come to you, how many of them, or what percentage roughly, I guess, would be, direct political, registered political advocacy groups versus clients like a construction company who's inadvertently being political without knowing it? How many people are just stumbling into this and not knowing that they're making these great missteps? Because this isn't really out there necessarily for the general public.
Yeah, I would say probably a third of my clients are political advocacy groups, and we're proactively registering and working on issues and figuring out how to do financial disclosure because they're thinking about these things. And probably 2/3 are people who come to me because they had no idea and they get a letter from the chief election officer of whatever election it is saying somebody's complained and we've noticed you've advertised on this issue. We deem that to be a political issue and you need to register within a certain time or we're going to fine you. And that's an increasingly large growing part of my practice. This is not a full-time legal practice doing third-party advertising, but every election cycle, I always have a few of them.
Now, what if it's somebody, say, a construction company, right, doing an LNG project or something like that, accidentally sends some material out there, and they get this letter and they freak out and they come to you. Typically, if they rescind that, do they have to register at that point? Or?
So I had one in the city of Victoria. In the previous municipal election, they were doing a big development. Some candidates were saying, oh, that's the wrong kind of development, terrible, I wouldn't approve that. Other candidates thought it was great, we need more housing, more density. They got a letter because somebody complained that they were advertising this beautiful neighborhood they were going to create, and that was influencing the election. And what I told them was, well, you better stop advertising your development. You're not under any regulatory requirement to do that. Hold off the month, just stop. But the city did require them because they were seeking a rezoning to post signs on their property. And in discussions with the chief elections officer at that time, we were able, in that particular situation, to get the chief election officer to say they can have their sign because it's pretty neutral and just says we're doing this, but you can't do advertising. To me, it's outrageous, but this is a paying client and they just don't want to be caught up in it. So they just stopped advertising their pre-sales during that period, which is also a bit of an issue. In British Columbia, at least, if you're pre-selling condominiums, you can only do that for a limited period of time before you start building. So they did lose about a month of their 9 months of pre-sales, but that was better to them than becoming a political involved in the election. They didn't want that.
Just really quickly, if anybody has a question as we move along, instead of waiting till the end,
Yeah.
then Troy will come around with the mic, and he's really good at that. So, okay,
There's one in the back, Troy. And I don't mind being interrupted with questions, but I'm going to rely on Tracy to organize that. All right.
Keep going, yeah.
So I'll start out and I'll quickly go through the charitable stuff, which I think a lot of you, just from talking to you, understand. Charities can only engage in their charitable purpose. So this is before getting into whether a charity is doing too much politics or not. In your communications, they have to meet what your charitable purpose is. The purpose will appear in your charity's governing documents. To be a charity, your purpose has to fall into one of 4 categories: relief of poverty, advancement of education, advancement of religion, or other purposes beneficial to the community. And the purpose has to provide a benefit to the public. Your charity, even if it's a great educational charity can't just about be having nice dinners for your members. It has to be conferring some benefit on the public, and they look at your budget and all that sort of thing. So somebody may complain to the CRA if a charity starts advocating for a political party or advocating on an issue. And it used to be that there was a pretty strict restriction on charities getting into advocacy at all. That has lessened in recent years. But if someone complains, CRA could still take the charity's tax number away if they don't deal well with the following questions. Is any activity of the charity directly or indirectly partisan? So charities can advocate for issues, they're still not supposed to be partisan. Are all of the communications related to the stated charitable purpose of the charity? And they'll always look for whether the charity is complying with other requirements. So if you're a charity and you're considering public policy advocacy, you should have a very close look at your statement of charitable purpose. So the Manning Foundation and Canada Strong and Free Network are, one's a charity, one's not. They have different activities that they can do in terms of public advocacy. Charities are also subject to third-party election rules, and these apply to everybody: developers, businesses, individuals, and actual advocacy groups. So these restrict or prohibit communications during writ periods, and pretty much universally across Canada now for some time prior to an election. And it generally only applies to communications to the public. It does not apply to communications within your group. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation can send out emails, letters to its list of supporters and donors, and that's not considered third-party advertising. But as soon as it puts up a billboard or takes an ad out in the newspaper or sends builds a website for public consumption that's going beyond its membership, then that becomes something that's captured. A couple of definitions of what is regulated. So advertising is the transmission to the public of a paid message that promotes or opposes a registered party or candidate, and that's been interpreted to include taking a position on an issue with which a registered party or candidate is associated. Partisan activities are activities that promote or oppose a political party, nomination contestant, potential candidate or party leader, other than by taking a position on an issue. So partisan activities would be holding a rally or doing some kind of activity that would be seen as also promoting or opposing a candidate. Surveys about voting intention or choices, or about an issue with which a candidate or party is associated, can be considered as advertising. And exceptions, I mentioned internal communications, most fundraising activities, earned media, and free web postings and social media, and also de minimis expenditures.
Bruce, I think we're going to take a question in the back, but before we do that, I've just got a question for you.
Sure.
You've been doing this for a really long time, and now that we see more and more on social media and more political advocacy on social media, how much has that kind of shifted what you're doing?
Well, it really doesn't change the fundamentals of it. I tell you, I mean, what social media and email and these sort of things have done has made it possible to do a lot of this third-party advertising for very little money, which is great because the spending limit on third-party advertising is ridiculously low. If you're in any major urban center in Canada, the third-party advertising spending restrictions per riding effectively mean you can't do traditional kind of media. You could never buy a single television ad or a couple of radio ads or a newspaper ad in Vancouver or Toronto for what you're allowed, to spend on a per riding basis, and even on a provincial or national basis, it's pretty limited. But a lot of third parties have gotten around that limit. You still have to register if you're going to do third party advertising on social media, if you're going to do some Facebook ads, but because you can usually do a lot of that stuff within the short spending limit. So in my experience, most third-party advertising of any that's serious is being driven online by the low threshold. Question at the back.
Am I on?
Okay, Peter? It sounds like you and I are basically on the same page that this is all just a big restriction on free speech and should just be abolished. But as you said, we have to deal with what we have to deal with. And for me, the biggest issue I see is that it's very complaints driven and therefore very arbitrary, right? So I'm a libertarian, I could run as a candidate, and if I say, well, no, we shouldn't save the whales, does that mean everybody saying we should save the whales is now, like all those stores in Vancouver Island with all the stickers on their window, they all paid to get those stickers printed, they're all advertising, right? But it requires complaints to actually get anything done, and then the enforcement of the complaints is very difficult as well, right? Same as if I said fair trade coffee is bad, it should be free trade coffee, right? Now every coffee shop in the entire country is a third-party advertiser. But I guess the problem then is how do we twist this back so it's more balanced and we can actually get to the point where, hey, this is being treated more equally. And if everybody had to face the consequences of how broad that definition is, then maybe we'd actually be able to get it reformed, right?
Sure, it is generally complaints driven. Even Elections Canada doesn't have a large investigative team that goes around looking for this stuff. And in my experience, it's pretty much exclusively complaints driven. I shouldn't say exclusively. There are times when something obvious has happened and an election officer has proactively gone out to somebody, but it's generally complaints driven. And in my experience, when somebody is innocently caught up in it, the chief electoral officer isn't going to go and fine you, or they're not interested in pursuing all that. They just want you to stop, and they'll issue you a threat, and most people will just stop because they don't want to be bothered with it. I think it'd be interesting if somebody wanted to challenge this in court. There have been a few challenges. I'm involved in a couple that they're dragging on right now. Stephen Harper was involved in one of the early challenges of this kind of law. Courts have generally been pretty accepting of the government's rationale for these laws so far. They accept that this is a violation of the Charter. It's a violation of free speech, it clearly is. It's a violation of some political rights, but to date, courts have been kind of bent over backwards to say that it's saved by Section 1, it's a reasonable and justifiable restriction because of what I said at the beginning. Political parties are quite properly restricted in how much they can spend because we don't want big money buying politics. And if you're going to do that, you can't just allow third parties to proliferate and get around that. And that's where the courts have generally gone so far. We've had a few victories for free speech, but it's mostly been the courts being very deferential to governments on this stuff.
And Bruce, are you seeing most of the complaints now in this day and age in 2022, are they mostly to do with social media?
I don't think so. I don't know why that isn't the case, but I think probably people doing stuff on social media, either the amount of spending is so low that it's not getting on anyone's radar, or advocacy groups that are doing social media are actually pretty sophisticated and they register and they know what they're doing. Most of the people that get caught up in it are completely unawares, individuals or businesses who just think they should be allowed to say what they want to say and are used to that as a Canadian and get surprised. That's been my experience. I don't know if I'm a representative sample or not, but there are strict expense limits, as I've mentioned. There are different amounts for local ridings versus provincial or national campaigns. All third parties have to file a financial disclosure. They have to show what they've spent, and they also have to disclose their contributions. If they haven't specifically raised money for this particular campaign, it's okay for an association to say this just came out of our general revenue. But if a third party has been fundraising for this purpose, then all of their donors are going to have to be disclosed. And there is a case going on in Alberta where there's a question about that right now, whether a third party that does all kinds of work and just happened to register may have to potentially disclose all their donors, which would be a big chill, I think, on donations. So far, that hasn't been the position that's been taken by any chief electoral officer to date, but it's a danger. Also, third parties who are funding these things do have to be careful if they're accepting contributions from outside of Canada. There's nothing wrong with a nonprofit in Canada accepting a donation from a non-Canadian, but if they're going to spend money on a third-party election advertising campaign and register, they have to demonstrate that their money does not come from outside the country. So that can create some complications. So the third way, I talked about charities, I talked about third-party advertising. The third way in which nonprofits and charities try to influence public policy is through direct communications with government. And often the line between what's a direct communication and what's a public advocacy communication is a little blurry. So I thought I'd just briefly mention the Lobbying Act as another piece of legislation people should be aware of. Most provinces, and certainly the federal government, has legislation that restricts communications for employees or other officers of societies where these communications, or companies, where these communications constitute a significant part of the duties of one employee, or would constitute a significant part of the duties of one employee if they were performed only by one employee. So, and the rule of thumb is 20% of a full-time equivalent. So if you've got a person who's a government relations person working for your company or your society or advocacy group, that person is probably going to have to register as a lobbyist and then disclose all the communications they have. But even if that person, it's only 20% of their job, but they're part of a department where other people are involved in that, it's probably something that you're going to have to do as well. So requests for publicly available information is an exception. Other exceptions are presentation of briefings to parliamentary committees, submissions to federal public office holders on the advocacy group's behalf with respect to the interpretation or enforcement of a statute, and participation in government-initiated activities like hearings, roundtables, or other consultations that are done in public don't have to be disclosed. Other than that, anytime you phone a federal official, meet with a federal official, write a letter to a federal official, you have to be careful that that's done through somebody who's registered as a lobbyist, and they have to provide reports, I think on a quarterly basis federally. It may be different in different provinces as to what their activities are. Even as a lawyer, a private sector lawyer, I've found myself having to do this. I don't consider myself a lobbyist. I'm not in the business of lobbying at all, but I've had clients who are dealing with federal regulatory issues, developments, and this sort of thing. I have arranged for meetings with MPs, cabinet ministers, and senior officials, and out of a sense of prudence, I have registered from time to time as a lobbyist and filed those reports to say I've had meetings. Of course, all that comes up because of my other more political roles, that I'm some kind of bought and paid for lobbyist by big developers or something, because I've registered once, but I didn't want to be in, I didn't want to have this happen to me. Governments of all political stripes, conservatives as well as parties to the left, have shown a great interest in limiting what actors can make political speech, especially during elections, but increasingly for long periods outside of elections. Individuals, corporations, nonprofits, and charities face increasing restrictions on when they can speak, what they can speak about, and how much they can spend. If you want to, as an individual or as a group, engage in public debate on political issues, you must be aware of these restrictions so that you don't end up like this poor fellow here. So that's my PowerPoint, and I didn't, Troy asked me, well, this is mostly an Alberta group, and do you have specific deadlines and stuff in Alberta? I did print out a bunch of stuff, and it's in my briefcase up in my hotel room, but if you really want to know, I can talk to you later about it. Although I've met a guy from Markham over there, people from Toronto, all over the place here. So like me, not everybody is from Alberta, and it's great to see so many people coming to participate. I think Tracy,
Lindsay, that's okay.
sorry.
Okay. That's really a similar name. It doesn't
Yeah. Anyway, I'm finished with this.
No, yeah,
I'm happy to
come
take
sit
questions.
down.
I didn't know if you had more comments or questions.
Who are you seeing most of these complaints from? I would think that a lot of it's coming from environmental groups. Is that the case, or?
Complaints? You know, environmental groups also have their issues with this. In fairness, especially on the charity side, almost every environmental group is a charity. And you'd hardly believe some of these guys were charities based on what you see as their bread and butter seems to be political activity. They seem to get away with a little less scrutiny than groups on the right. I would say that most of the complaints that I've seen come from candidates who don't like the fact that somebody has a view other than theirs and want to shut down any opposition.
Put your hand up if you have a
Question here from Mark.
I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on a candidate being associated with an issue. Let's say, for instance, I am advocating for something for my charity, and I'm first out of the gate with it. I'm making it clear what my position is on this particular issue. If the candidate even mentions that way down on their platform and never talks about it, is that a problem? And also, if I'm first to the table with that issue and candidates adopt it later, can you elaborate a bit on that?
So there hasn't been a lot of judicial interpretation on this, but my understanding from dealing with different elections officers is just because a candidate says something, they won't immediately say that's an election issue. But if it becomes a significant issue between candidates or parties, and you know, I'm extremely uncomfortable with a bureaucrat making that decision, but that's how our legislation works, is they basically can decide, okay, this is not really a big issue in this election, but this is. So we're gonna let you continue to talk about this, but we won't let you talk about that, because in our subjective opinion, the parties or the candidates are really, in their platforms, are disagreeing about this. And I've had election officers take me through brochures or online platforms to sort of prove their point. And so, you know, sometimes it's pretty obvious that something is a big issue, and sometimes it's less so. It may be something that one candidate supports, but the other candidates aren't running around making much of that. The legislation doesn't help you. It's very ambiguous, and it's left to election officers to interpret.
Okay, Philip?
Yeah, just in terms of historical context in making political contributions and how this relates to third-party advocacy, when did the federal government or provincial governments initiate legislation that restricted, say, amounts of corporate donations or even individual donations going forward? Was it like 20 years ago, 25 years ago?
Well, federal political contributions contribution limits were established, I believe, in the late 70s, and that's the same time that they brought in the very generous tax receipts for political contributions. In British Columbia, which I'm more familiar with, British Columbia didn't, various provinces started copying that. British Columbia didn't do so until, I believe, the 1990 election in BC. And it may have been later in some other places, but so that's you know, that was the first step, was political parties are only going to be able to spend X during a campaign, candidates can only spend X. And then we'll give generous tax receipts to their donors. The next phase that came in was, we're now going to restrict third parties. And the next phase that came in is, we're going to restrict how much people can donate, and then make sure that only individuals can donate and not unions or corporations. And so that's over a sort of 30-year period. But I think it started in the late 70s. Although I'm older than most people in this room, I was still pretty young in the late 70s, so I don't have an exact recollection of that.
Okay, up here in the front, Don.
Thanks so much. I found it really interesting that when you'd answered Peter's question earlier, you had mentioned that the courts seem to, rule on the side of the government of, upholding these kind of stringent rules. Do you think there's any kind of legitimate movement on the political side of things to maybe ease up or get rid of some of these rules? And if not, what do you think kind of needs to be done to make this an issue that people care about?
Yeah. I know that Troy has been fighting this for his whole adult life, and I remember he posed for a picture outside of the Elections BC offices once with a big gag on his mouth and his hands tied and a little masochistic looking. But a lot of advocacy groups have taken a run at it. And this is a disappointment for me as somebody who's been involved in partisan politics. I don't recall any political party really pushing back on this stuff. Some have been slower to adopt it than others. The Social Credit Party in BC wasn't keen on this stuff, and that's why BC was one of the last places to do all these things. But politicians, even if they say they don't like this when they're in opposition because they don't like the restrictions on freedom of speech, once they're in government and they actually can do something about it, most governments are quite happy to have strong tools to shut down opposition. And that's just the reality that I've seen in my career.
Okay, back to the room here, Dan.
Thanks. So the last presentation had an example of a form letter campaign to senators on Bill C-11. I was wondering if a nonprofit does something like that, are they in risk of going in? Does that count as then not just public advocacy but also lobbying, because they're getting people to send form letters to senators and MPs and stuff?
I don't think encouraging someone else to contact a senator would be considered lobbying. And actually, lobbying is about government officials, not elected officials. So unless that senator is in cabinet, I think that particular letter to a senator that we saw is not likely to be a lobbying issue. Definitely could be a third-party advertising issue. If you're sending that letter to your own supporters or your own members in your internal network, that's okay. That's an exception to the third-party rules. And if you're sending it outside an election period, which I think that letter was, and outside of the legislative pre-writ period, it's probably fine. But if you're writing letters to members of the public like that during a prohibited period, I would say you would be very prudent to register, and it would be regarded as advertising. Direct mail is advertising under the legislation, and that would be direct mail, or it may not go in the mail, and that may mean the cost is lower, but there's a cost to it, and if it's more than $500 federally, it would have to be registered.
What if that percentage of their MP and their MP has to be cabinet minister?
If you're sending it to your MP, if you're an individual person, you are exempt from the lobbying legislation. The third-party advertising rules apply to individuals. The Lobbying Act only applies to organizations or businesses. So unless that individual person is running their own business as a lobbyist, no. An individual person on a one-shot basis writing to their MP who happens to be a cabinet minister, that's okay. That's okay. So far, who knows in 10 years what restrictions they'll invent up, but we're okay now.
Okay, we've got a question from someone who hears from Victoria, Bruce, if you can believe it. Aiden. Go ahead.
No.
Sweet. Yeah, thank you for speaking to us. You spoke about third-party advocacy in Victoria in the last municipal election. BC is going through municipal elections at the moment. Is there any third-party advocacy you could speak on that's notable in this time around?
I don't have any that I can talk about right now.
Whoa, that sounds interesting.
We've got a question back there. Bruce, I wanted to ask you, how much are you dealing with unions now, either as the complainants or clients? Like, how much is that more of a factor now as opposed to maybe 10, 15 years ago?
Well, unions are caught up in this legislation as well, and most unions are pretty sophisticated, so they register as lobbyists, and nobody seems to think twice about them lobbying government. Businesses are criticized for it all the time, but unions do that. Unions do register as third parties, but most large unions their main political activity is endorsing candidates and then communicating that to their members. So, you know, if you're a union with 30,000 members, that's a pretty big loophole. You can send those communications out to your members and say, we recommend you vote this way or that way, and that's all exempted. So they don't have to register for that. But if they're some unions will also want to do general advertising, lots of them do, and they register. And they do provincial campaigns where they can spend a bit more money. It's still restricted though.
Do you think more needs to take place in that to kind of prevent what's happening there?
Well, you know, I personally come at it from a free speech perspective, and I don't really have an issue with unions having free speech. I think everybody should have it. I do have an issue with unions taking mandatory dues from people, and you know, but that's a whole other issue. I'm more of a right to work person and all that, but that you know, if unions are going to exist, I think they should exist through voluntary donations, not mandatory. Just that's way off topic here.
Future panel.
But if they exist on that basis, I have no problem with them exercising free speech and telling people their opinions.
Okay, our last questions to Norman.
Thank you, Bruce. Quick question. Would it be considered colluding if during the election period, if a third-party advocacy, they don't do advertising, but they are doing training or they're supporting campaign workers or campaign managers to select the candidates just to help build that infrastructure? Would that be considered colluding, or that's different?
There's no restriction. The collusion restriction is only on things that meet the definition of advertising. Now that definition I took you through is pretty broad and includes events and rallies and things. So if that training happened in a writ period at a meeting like this, and the chief electoral officer thought that this was really in aid of a candidate, it wasn't general education, it could get caught up in it. I don't know of any, I can't point you any examples where that's happened, but you know, it would have to meet the definition of advertising, but that definition is broad enough to include an event like this. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody, and thank you so much, Bruce.